Well, something you didn't mention that I wanted to ask about, since it was so important to our conversation, is if this evolving field of behavioral genomics is poised in any particular particularly fascinating way to help us better understand this interaction between genetics and environment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's lots of examples of that. Um, I've tried several times to get money for this, and I know it's ethically a little bit on the borderline. But growing up in a poor family in Chicago, I always did well at school, and I was in a school system that helped me get scholarships to go to university and all of that. But if you can predict kids who are going to have problems like reading problems, you don't have to wait till we can predict about 10% of the variance in reading. Now, it's not 100%, but reading is quite highly heritable, maybe 60% heritable. But we can today predict 10% of the variance in reading. So that means you can predict what we call reading disability or dyslexia, which is another one of these hoaxes. It's medicalizing these things to pretend reading disability is a real thing. It's an etiologically distinct disorder. It's not. Kids have reading problems, but what's to be gained by medicalizing it and pretending it's an etiologically distinct disorder? My child has dyslexia. No, your kid has some reading problems. It might be a lot of reasons for that, but we can predict which kids are going to have reading problems. And the way we know now is you wait till kids get to school, and after a year or two, they're doing poorly at reading. And you can help them learn to read, but it's hard. Once Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, it's hard to put them back together again. There's a lot of collateral damage once kids start failing at school. So if you can predict who's going to have reading problems, there are good language interventions in early childhood before kids learn to read that will then help kids read when they get to school so they don't have to fail. And the trouble with these interventions is the ones that work, other than these gimmicks like growth mindset, the ones that work are expensive and intensive. So you've got to target it for certain kids. But the neat thing about it is there can't be any harm in that. Giving kids a language intervention that will help prevent reading problems when they get to school. So um, I, I'm particularly interested in a bigger issue, and that is using these polygenic scores to help us identify kids from most socially disadvantaged environments who have the genetic goods and to help them capitalize on their goods, because it's a wasted part of our intellectual capital in society, because kids from the worst socioeconomic environments will go to schools that aren't very good, and they're just much less likely to succeed. But with a bit of a leg up, you might be able to help them realize their potential. And so that's something that just interests me, because I grew up in inner city Chicago in a poor family where nobody of all my cousins, nobody, my parents, my sister, nobody went to university. And I didn't even know what it was. I'd never even heard of graduate school. The only reason I went to graduate school is I had this wonderful advisor who said, you really ought to think about graduate school. And I had no idea what it was. But then he said the magic words for a poor kid in Chicago: they pay you to go. So that's why I went to graduate school, because I liked being a student, and they would pay me to go to school. I didn't have to pay anything. They paid me to go. So what's not to like? So
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
yeah,
Enjoying it.
great.
Yeah.
I'm glad they still
But
have those.
I'm curious, everything that you just described sounds, at least on the surface, to be extremely positive if you want to help less fortunate people with the tools of your research. So, why is it, if you could put your finger on it, ethically borderline or perceived that way?
Um, I think with the reading example, it's hard for people to deny that. If you studied reading ability, people freak out. But reading disability, because they think it's a disorder, although it's really not, it's somehow okay to try and fix that. But the example I mentioned with low socioeconomic status, um, it just makes people very uneasy, I think, to think about selecting kids on that basis and trying to help them realize their genetic potential. I can give you some counter arguments, which I've run into when I submit these grants that aren't funded to do that. It's like, but you're going to mark that kid so the kid will be in a family with other kids. You're going to pick one kid and give them special advantages. That's a problem, they would say. And just the idea of DNA coming into contact with socioeconomic status, really, because some people think of that as the ultimate environmental measure. But do you know the main driver of the predictive power of socioeconomic status is educational attainment of the parents? And that is a highly heritable characteristic. So we now know, I don't think it's controversial, but 10 years ago, if you said socioeconomic status is heritable like everything else, people would go nuts. But I think most people accept that now, that there's a strong heritable component to socioeconomic status. So those are sort
Most
of the reasons.
psychologists or most
Uh,
people
well,
in the
certainly
public sphere? Because I
sociologists.
would, okay,
Yeah.
sociologists.
What would you say? Most psychologists would accept genetic influence on
Well, I'm
socioeconomic
not a
status?
psychologist, but I would definitely say that if I polled the philosophy department at Stanford, for instance, or at least if I polled the graduate students in the philosophy department at Stanford, I
Good
bet
point.
that, uh, yeah, I bet that less than 1% of people would say that socioeconomic status is heritable on any level. So
Did
it's
you say
interesting that
less?
sociologists
Okay. What was the
they
percentage you
would
said?
basically deny that it's heritable. They would just deny
Sociologists.
it flat out.
But what did you say about
No, no,
Stanford?
no. Stanford graduate students would say that it is not heritable, but which is interesting because the sociologists would apparently say that it is. So it just reflects
Ah,
uh,
okay. Interesting.
something that the public is not aware of about the research.
Well, I find, you've mentioned this before about the public acceptance. Very early on, you said, well, the public often has trouble with this. Well, when my book Blueprint came out, I wanted to give public lectures. I gave 30, 40 public sort of lectures. And I was a bit nervous, about the reaction. But I found that the public is actually very accepting of genetic influence, even on something like socioeconomic status. They, the basic reaction I get is, I didn't know about any of that. It's not that they're antagonistic, whereas the antagonism I found more in academia, especially in education, in sociology back then. I agree that sociology for a while, it was unclear whether it was going to remain a science, but I think it has resolved itself as a science. And if it's scientific, you expect data to rule in the end. To people would accept data. Um, so I was really quite pleased to find that I got very little negativity, very little hostility about talking to public groups and saying that genetics is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals.
Hmm. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe the cultural milieu is just different in the UK than it is here at this point. But I would guess that if you asked most of the people on campus what the dominant factors are in socioeconomic status, they would probably refer you to um, structural racism or capitalism or uh, I guess these sorts of features of society rather than genetics.
Yeah. But, it's empirical, and twin and adoption studies converge on the conclusion that socioeconomic status is at least 40% heritable. And the educational component of it is probably even more heritable. Then income is less heritable, which kind of makes sense to me. I mean, professors don't make much money compared to other people. But uh, it's interesting that you say that. I'm surprised. I thought you were going to say that graduate students at Stanford would all say, "Oh, yeah, it's heritable." So that's interesting. It's an empirical question, isn't it? I have done surveys of people, not so much in academia, but maybe it would be time to do it again. The ones I did of the public and teachers. Teachers, I find surprising. They get nothing about genetics in their training to be a teacher, and yet they accept genetic influence just as much as other members of the public do. Maybe even more so. Because if you stand up and teach 30 kids, you can't help but notice that some of them just take off with the learning. You almost just have to stay out of their way, whereas other kids are going to need a lot more help to reach some minimal levels of literacy and numeracy that they need to survive in our increasingly technological society.